I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to this seminar to Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. This lecture series is possible because of the generous support of the patrons of this channel. In fact, this entire channel is an experiment in crowd-funded university-level education made accessible completely for free. Open access, no paywalls. Access to reliable scholarly education on any topic shouldn't plunge anybody into thousands of dollars of debt, and I'm committed to making topics that I have expertise in and the history of Western esotericism as accessible to the public as possible. That said, if you benefit from the channel or from this course, I'd ask you to please consider supporting the channel for the production of free courses like this via a yearly contribution to my Patreon for as little as like $54 a year. It's basically a cup of coffee a month. But I genuinely appreciate your consideration for supporting this channel and making this kind of educational content possible. But to be clear, I am grateful for the work that I'm able to do, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this open access seminar, To Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. All right, everyone, we've now arrived in some sense, which I feel like it's been a very long wind-up, but perhaps a necessary wind-up to get us to where we need to be, because in some sense, if we, I think, jump directly into the Hekhalot literature itself, it's so bewildering that I think without a lot of this build-up, we're not going to really appreciate, one, how radical it is, and two, we're not going to appreciate how strange it is, and we're not going to make heads or tails of it, because it is an admittedly bewildering literature. And bewildering for both editorial reasons, as we'll talk about today, but also bewildering in terms of content, because it's frankly some of the weirdest literature ever produced in Judaism. In fact, I would say that the Shiur Koma literature is probably the weirdest literature ever produced in Judaism. If it weren't written in Hebrew, it would be unrecognizable as Jewish literature, frankly. But we'll talk about that more as we get into it today. But what we did last time was really take a pretty intense, although I think a little bit too quick, but you know, sometimes it goes that way, but a pretty intense deep dive into the rabbinical analysis of the Merkavah literature as it appears in Tractate Chagiga, in the Mishnah, and the Tosefta, and in the two Talmuds. And what we get in the rabbinical literature is a kind of limited engagement with the Hekhalot literature. And I say limited in the sense that on the one hand, they can't deny it's there. And so they have to do something with it. And primarily what they seem to have done, as we've talked about last time, is that primarily their interest is in reframing it or in trying to deflect it, right? To try to say, look, let's don't get into that stuff. It's dangerous. You'll get yourself killed. You'll go crazy. Or they, I think most of all, want to scare us. I think that's the main thing. And they're sort of the Nancy Reagans of the ancient world, where their desire is to scare us away from the big, bad, evil Merkavah literature by basically telling us that if we try, not only will we fail, but we'll become a heretic and die along the way. And even if we do succeed, recall in the famous humbling of Metatron, that we will only get a vision of this other angel, Metatron. And even that angel is not the highest on the food chain. Even Metatron can be humbled by other angels. As we learned in Third Enoch, he can be humbled, at least in this case, by the angel Gabriel. Just as a side note, one of the sort of sideways things that comes out of that whole story of the humbling of Metatron is the Pulsa de Nura, which is a prayer, a death prayer, basically, that exists inside the Kabbalah, where, as you probably know, it's against Jewish law to pray that someone dies. You can't pray for anyone to die. But what you can do is pray for an audit of their sins. And you can basically say that the Malach HaMaves, the angel of death, you can invoke them and say, hey, look, you got to make sure they haven't committed some sins. And if there are, as you probably know, there are certain sins where God has the right to immediately kill you if you break those sins. And so basically you call for an audit of someone's sins, and if the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, finds that they have committed these sins, then they might be killed. At any rate, the prayer is called Pulsa de Nura, fiery lashes, and it's exactly that phrase, although in the plural, in the Talmud, where we actually get the origins of that. So basically it's like having the same thing that happened to Metatron happen to you, but of course you wouldn't survive it because you're not Metatron. At any rate, that aside, completed. Let's get into the Merkavah. Let's get into the Merkavah literature itself, because we've finally gotten enough introductory material done with it, and now we can turn our attention to the literature itself. And what I want to point out is that the Merkavah, the Hekhalot literature, survives in about 47 distinct manuscripts. So that's a pretty healthy manuscript tradition in terms of how much that does survive. If you want to compare that to something like the Corpus Hermeticum survives in only a handful of manuscripts. So in many ways, the Hekhalot literature represents a more rich manuscript history than many other forms of Western esotericism. And so you can think about this literature actually survives it has a better attestation in many ways, at least in the Jewish world, than other forms of magical texts and other forms of literature like this. But we can basically divide the Hekhalot literature into two distinct groupings. The first grouping are all the European manuscripts. So there are about 47 European manuscripts that survive. Those didn't originate in Europe, but they have survived in Europe. And we can talk about the material found in the Cairo Geniza. As you may know, one of the rules in Judaism is that if the name of God is written on a piece of paper, that piece of paper can't be summarily just tossed in the trash. It has to be buried. And so most communities have what is called a Geniza, which literally means a storehouse. And inside of the Geniza, you store literature in order to bury it at a later point. You collect a bunch of it and you usually ritually bury it, sometimes around the holidays. But at any rate, what's really lucky for us about the Cairo Geniza is that I just saw it this year actually, is that the Cairo Geniza, in order to get to it, you have to basically climb a ladder in the women's section. And because it's in the women's section, and two, you have to climb a ladder to get to it, no one really went out of their way to go up there and clean it out and bury it. And so lucky for us, for 1,000 years, basically, literature accumulated inside of that Geniza. And it wasn't until the 19th century when a European scholar went in there and realized, basically, we have a treasure trove of 1,000 years worth of Jewish literature basically stuck in this attic. And out of that attic came some of our earliest magical texts, like the Sefer HaRazim, and also a pretty substantial amount of texts from the Geniza. Now, what's interesting about the Geniza is that a lot of times those manuscripts are a good bit earlier than the manuscripts that have survived in Europe, and they provide us a better reading of the European manuscripts for reasons that we'll get into in just a minute. But anyway, 47 manuscripts, right? 47 manuscripts of about seven different texts. So just to go through briefly some of the most important of these manuscripts, just so you'll have a sense of what we're talking about. And if I reference manuscripts, I might say in, right? So you may want to just have some idea of what we're talking about in these manuscripts. But there are basically seven important European manuscripts that are worth mentioning for what we're talking about. And the most important manuscript in many ways that is important for us is going to be Manuscript N. Manuscript N is a 15th or 16th century Ashkenazic manuscript. And what's important about Manuscript N is that it interpolates a large amount of magical material into the Hekhalot literature. And so it preserves both magical material, but also Hekhalot material, and it interpolates magical material into the Hekhalot material itself. And so in many ways, Manuscript N, which is housed in, for the folks in New York, if you want to go up to JTS, it is housed in the Jewish Theological Seminary. So I have a copy of it if you want to see it. I called over there and got a copy of it just on Friday. But if you want to see it, I can upload it to the course description. But at any rate, here are some of the manuscripts. I'm not going to go through all of them. But if you want sort of a general idea, our earliest manuscript is a 13th century Ashkenazi manuscript. And we also have a pretty healthy dosing of Italian manuscripts, Sephardi manuscripts, Byzantine, and Italian. So just to do some geography, let's say that some of these texts originate in Palestine, 3rd, 4th, 5th century. They're edited further into the Amoric period, into what is now Iraq, and they make their way back to Palestine, and then they seem to go over North Africa into Italy and eventually make their way into Germany. These texts are moving. So it's really important to note that not only do they have these texts exist in a relatively large amount of editorial profiles, but also these texts were mobile. And texts that are mobile like that are interesting because it means there's a demand for them. People are requesting them. People are interested in them. People are taking the time. I mean, again, you can think about the dangers of traveling back in the Middle Ages. Imagine that you have to make pretty careful considerations about what you travel with. And the fact that these texts moved meant that the people that moved them cared about them. And these ideas were important.
And so this is an apparently very, very important side of how this goes down. But the last thing I would want to mention here is that the two things, the Karoganese manuscripts represent manuscripts from about the 9th to the 11th centuries. So that is the earliest layer of the manuscript tradition. So 9th to the 11th century. But the European manuscripts seem to have gone into a filter that is typical of Jewish magical and occult literature in general. And that filter is that they go through the filter of the Kalonymus family. The Kalonymus family was an Italian family, originally Greek. They may have even come from Syria. It's hard to say exactly. But at any rate, the Kalonymus family, you can hear their name is Greek. So they eventually settle in Italy, and at some point they move north into the Ashkenaz. They move into the area around Regensburg, which for my Hildegard of Bingen folks will know that is where Hildegard of Bingen was. So it's really weird to think that, and that was a relatively remote area, by the way, at the time. I mean, the nuns that worked with Hildegard really worked there, took us off to build that monastery there, or that nunnery there. But here in Regensburg, we have a unusual family or movement. It's not clear, called the Chaste Ashkenaz, the Pietists, the German Pietist movement. And in the 12th to 13th centuries, the Chaste Ashkenaz develop a very unusual Jewish theology, probably one of the most unusual Jewish theologies ever developed. They were highly interested in magic. They were highly interested in demonology. And one of the things that's very important about the Chaste Ashkenaz is that they took the presence of evil, the existence and in the experience of evil, as proof that God was real, and that the more they suffered, and again, you can kind of get some sort of medieval Catholic vibes here, that the suffering of the community was proof of God's love and God's justice. And therefore, they lived in horrifying times, being massacred by crusaders and things, but they took the existence of evil to be very important in their theology, and so they preserved a great deal of demonological material that was theologically very important to them, and magical material as well. And so almost all of the material that they developed, or they preserved, they're really interested in these more metaphysical, we might say occult topics. And the Chaste Ashkenaz were the final editors of much of the Hekhalot material as we have it. So this is an important thing to note, that a lot of the Hekhalot material as we have it has been edited by the Chaste Ashkenaz. They've probably done some interpolation of their own theology into the material, but we can compare that in some ways with the Karoganese material, and then we can get some general sense of what the Vorlage, the original text, might have looked like. But the Chaste Ashkenaz are also people that would eventually would influence people like Eliezer of Worms, who wrote the first major magical commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah, and that's where, of course, where we get all the stuff about building golems comes from. So, and also they would eventually, their influence would go in the West, and they would eventually underwrite what would become the origins of Kabbalah in the Middle Ages. So the Chaste Ashkenaz are incredibly important in this story. And a very unusual movement, very unusual family, but a very unusual theology of Judaism, which, by the way, was never adopted. Their theology was never adopted by the wider Jewish world, and they did us a great service of preserving a bunch of material, but ultimately their philosophies and their ideologies were never adopted ultimately by the wider Jewish world. So to talk a bit about the textual integrity of the Hekhalot literature, rather, is that part of what makes the Hekhalot literature difficult to study is that it is inherently an unstable, internally dynamic group of literature. That seems to speak to the fact that this is probably primarily composed orally and passed down orally, and only written down at various points, and written down in kind of a bit of a haphazard way. And so the going theory that exists now, put forward by Schaeffer, is that the original form of the Hekhalot literature were microforms, literally tiny sugyot, paragraph-length sugyot. And these paragraph-length sugyot were often stitched together with other sugyot, and then those sugyot or paragraphs, they were stitched together and then edited together in a way that made them kind of make sense. And if you've studied the Hekhalot literature, one of the things that you'll know is that there are often these very breakneck transitions that don't seem to have anything to do with each other. This kind of staccato character is typical of the fact that it looks like lots of different little parts of this literature are all put together, then edited into texts. And so the texts are marked by a deep degree of internal dynamism, where it's very difficult to know exactly where one text begins and one text ends. And in many cases, it's almost impossible to even produce a critical apparatus, because almost every single word differs in some small degree, either spelling or grammatically or something else, from almost every other manuscript. So it's to the point where, and I'll show this in a minute when I show the Davila text, it's to the point where it's impossible, with the exception of Hekhalot Rabbati, to get a stable enough manuscript to actually build a critical apparatus, because there's so much internal diversity from manuscript to manuscript that it's difficult to get a sense of what's going on, to get a sense of the underlying stability of the text. So what's happened is that rather than producing a critical edition of the Hekhalot material, Schaeffer actually devised what he calls a synopsis. And the synopsis, as we'll see in a minute, is he literally just puts every single manuscript against each other. So you can see all of them at the same time. It's a synopsis. They're meant to be seen all at once. And when you look at it, and as we'll see it in a minute, you can see that they're actually quite diverse. And one of the problems that comes out of this is that if you want to make a conclusion based on a very close reading of the Hekhalot material, you have to decide which manuscript you're going to trust, because in many ways they're all different. And so it's really difficult to say, well, this very particular reading is what I'm interested in. But the problem with that is that particular reading may only occur in one manuscript. And so how do you know which is the original manuscript? Now, what you can do is go back to the Karaganism text and say, these are older, and they're perhaps a better witness to an older layer of the text. But is that always an indicator of the true nature of the text? And the answer, of course, is no. So what Davila has produced, and I will talk about how to study the Davila in just a moment, what Davila has produced is what I would call a diplomatic translation. A diplomatic translation. He's tried to produce a translation that takes as much of the material as possible. He's maximizing the material, and he's trying to say, this is a translation that represents the best readings available to us. It's not a critical translation, because we just don't have access to that. The texts are internally too diverse for that, as we'll see in just a minute, but it is about diplomacy. And this is another thing I want to say, is that diplomacy always involves compromise. Every single word that Davila chooses to render in English, he's having to pick that word over 4 or 5 others. And every sentence is a compromise. And so if you are interested in really getting into the material, you need to be able to understand and appreciate where these compromises are being made. And to show you what this looks like in practice, we can take a look at, this slide, by the way, is the slide I was going to mention last week. This is, for folks who can read some Hebrew, this is the fragment of Rabbi Akiva, the 4 that go to Pardes, in the first person plural, right? We, right? So it says, Rabbi Akiva says, right, we 4 went to the Pardes. Notice here it's in the first person plural. And so this grammatically, if Maury Jones is correct, and I think that he is, this 338 synopsis is the earliest version of the 4 that go to Pardes. That we begin with a first person account where Rabbi Akiva is talking, we 4 went to Pardes, and I came back, and I ascended. And what we'll see here is in this one, it's in the first person, right? And it's not because lo shani gadol. It's not because I was greater than the other folks, right? But, right, since I was able to do all this stuff according to the Mishnah, a little bit, you can see here, right? Lo shani, right? He's speaking in the first person. And so this is for Murray Jones, proof that the 4 that go to Pardes did not originally occur in the third person. It was written in the first person, perhaps by Akiva himself. At any rate, that's just thought I'd include this little piece, because it's important in the history of all this. So let's just take a look at technically what we're talking about in terms of studying the material, because I'm hoping that as of this course, as of this part of the course, everyone's going to be in the actual material itself. Everyone should be equipped to get into the material. But let's talk about what we see here. So I just picked a random part of Hekhalot Zutarti, right? So this part is not exceptional in any way. It's actually very typical of Hekhalot Zutarti if you had the chance to read it. So, right, we're looking at a section of praxes. So this is some 7 divine names and how to use them. And so we're seeing various people through history: Moses, Balaam, the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, David. So there are all these divine names. So what we're looking at is just various peoples mentioning various divine names, and then eventually we'll get some uses for them. If you're looking at these capital letters, these ones here in capital letters, it's because Davila doesn't know how they're to be read. That is to say, we don't know what the vocalization is. They're proper names, but they're proper names for which the vocalization is not clear. And so these divine names, sometimes these are called nomina barbara, but we don't know exactly what the vocalization of these are, but they're meant to have some kind of magical power. So here we have Davila's diplomatic translation on this side. Here we have the synopsis numbers, so you can look them up in the synopsis. So if you go to the synopsis over here, here is the synopsis as it occurs for synopsis 357. So here is the actual sugya, right, of the Hekhalot literature from Hekhalot Zutarti. And notice here, right, that they're pretty close, right? Baruch Shmo Agadol, right? So we can see like the great fearsome name. And so we can see here that there's some consistency, but notice, right, from manuscript to manuscript, there is variation, right? There is variation. And if you want to see that variation, you can see it here in the Hebrew and Aramaic. This is in Hebrew, I think. So you can see this here in the Hebrew. It'll switch randomly to Aramaic sometimes. But this is in Hebrew here. But notice here, right, we see Davila's diplomatic translation, but down below here, he's translated every space where the manuscripts differ from his diplomatic translation. So if you see M, N, O, M22, these are all manuscripts. So what he's doing here is showing you down in the footnotes how he's made the decisions he's made. And so you should always be doing three things at once when you're reading the Davila. You should be reading the English, obviously. You should be consulting the decisions he's made and why he's made them. And then, if you're able, you should be taking a look back at the Hebrew Aramaic and to see it for yourself, right? And so this is the complexity of what I'm talking about. When I talk about the text being complex, here are 5 different manuscripts we have of Synopsis 357. Here's Davila's diplomatic translation, and here's the apparatus, as much as it is critical apparatus, right? Trying to show you how he's made the decisions he's made in terms of the variant readings. Now, what's really interesting about this is that I think this is one of the pages where it mentions it. I could be wrong. I tried to get one. But one of the things to keep in mind here is that you should not throw your hands up when you see these nomina barbara, these magical names. You should not throw your hands up here and just go, I have no idea what those are, and they're completely mysterious. The truth of the matter is that Gershom Scholem, who folks may know that before he was studying Kabbalah, he was a philologist. This is the thing that often gets lost on people about Gershom Scholem. He was a philologist. And Gershom Scholem was one of the first people to show definitively that hiding inside of some of these nomina barbara are Latin and Greek names. Latin and Greek names. So there are Latin and Greek words. Now, you have to squint and look sideways at them sometimes because they're Latin and Greek words written in Hebrew, transliterated into Latin letters. And so this is a very, very different, very, very weird thing to have to do. But I'll give you one example of this. There is a nomina barbara, and I don't know that I put it in this one, but there's one of these divine names where they've been able to decipher that it's something like the Lord of Heaven and Earth, but it's written in Greek and not in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. Now, why I think that matters a lot is because one of the big questions we've been going over and over and over again is, where did this stuff come from? Where did it come from? And there's always this debate between, did it come from Palestine or did it come from Babylon? That's the debate. My contention is that when we see pericopes that clearly have Latin and Greek words in them, my suggestion is that when we see Latin and Greek words in these pericopes, it's much more likely to me that we're seeing something coming from a Palestinian context. Why? Because Latin and Greek aren't being spoken in Persia. Persia, in the Sasanian context, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But in Palestine, those are the languages they're working in. They're thinking in Aramaic, they're writing in Hebrew, they're hearing Latin and Greek. Now, one of the big questions that you can ask, and this is a question that I still don't know the answer to, is why in the world would esoteric Jewish writers who are picking out magically powerful names for God be picking out names in Greek? Why would they pick a Greek word and then make it a magically powerful name for God if part of their commitment is that Hebrew is the language that God speaks and the language by which God spoke creation into being? I don't know the answer to that question. It is perplexing. What it might be is the case that these actually might be cryptographic stuff, but we might be looking at some degree of cryptology here. And we do know that there are cryptographic elements in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We do know that there are cryptic scripts being used in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We do know that there are codes in the Talmud, right, where there are Atbash ciphers and other kinds of ciphers that the rabbis used. So what we might be looking at in some of these divine names are ciphers. We might be looking at codes. We might be looking at gematria, right? We might be looking at all kinds of things. So the problem, of course, is that we don't know. And the problem, of course, is that a lot of these texts they've gotten garbled over time. The manuscripts have gotten garbled. But just to point out here that, again, don't throw your hands up when you look at some of these divine names and think to yourself, oh, this is just gibberish. These people, language mattered to them. These words are magically important words for them. I don't think we're ever looking at gibberish. My assumption is always what I take to be the principle of charity. Always assume that the thing you're reading makes sense or made sense. Assume the principle of charity and then do your due diligence to try to sort out what these could have been. And again, you might be surprised to find out that that living beneath it is a Greek word, that living beneath it is a Latin word, that living beneath it is gematria or a code. We don't know. But at any rate, this is what you're looking at when you're looking at the Hekhalot literature as it exists. The first place you can look is if you read Hebrew and Aramaic, you want to look at the synopsis, right? So these are all the different manuscripts that represent synopsis 357. Then take a look, if you can, obviously, at the Davila. This is the diplomatic translation. And then take a look at the apparatus beneath it and have the apparatus talk to the translation, talk to the original text. I will say that one of the things I do like about the fact that the Davila's translation has been criticized as being overly literal and unliterary. I think that's perfect. I think it's perfect because what he's doing is he's translating it as grammatically as close in English as it appears in Hebrew, and you're getting a sense of just how staccato the text sounds, right? Again, if you've ever had the chance to read magical literature, especially from the Middle Ages and from the Greek magical papyri, it is not literary. They're not trying to impress you in many ways with literary bombast. What they're trying to do is tell you how to do something. It's like a cookbook, right? It's much more like that kind of literature. And therefore, it's very important to know that this literature can have this staccato quality to it. And it has that quality to it because these are meant to be practical manuals. This is not meant to impress you with the literary style. However, I will say that one of the places where the literary style is on display are places like the hymns of Hekhalot Rabbati. And those hymns are incredible, and they've been actually so incredible that they have been incorporated into Jewish prayer life. At any rate, this is what we're looking at. When you're studying the literature, this is what you're looking at, and this is how you're going about it. So let's talk about what survives, right? Here's an example of a manuscript from the Kaira-Geniza. Notice it's a fragment, like many of them. It's written in a very nice hand, though, so it's the kind of thing where it's actually quite easy to read. But it is a fragment, and you can get these really long nomina barbara. You can see an example here of like a really long series of nomina barbara there. At any rate, let's go through some of the texts and talk about them very briefly now, and then talk about them more in depth for the rest of today. So Hekhalot Rabbati is our longest. It is our most stable text. Now, this is a text for which there is a critical apparatus. It is very stable, and it is primarily interested in hymnic mysticism. So a great deal of the space taken up in Hekhalot Rabbati is with these ecstatic hymns, like I said, some of which have made their way into Jewish liturgy. Schaeffer argues that Hekhalot Rabbati is the earliest of the Hekhalot literature. That is not a point that people all agree on. Other people tend to believe that Hekhalot Zutarti is the earliest, but that is a debate that's just going on in literature. So do with that what you want. Often attached to Hekhalot Rabbati, which Hekhalot Rabbati translates to the greater Hekhalot, attached to the Hekhalot Rabbati is literature called the Sar Torah literature. In the Sar Torah literature, you summon an angel in order to learn the truth, the secrets of the Torah. So the Hekhalot Rabbati often has a Sar Torah literature attached to it. I'm going to go into more detail on these in just a minute. Hekhalot Zutarti, the lesser Hekhalot. This text is very unstable. It's represented very differently in the manuscript tradition. It is arguably the earliest, although again, there's debate about that. And Hekhalot Zutarti contains the largest amount of praxes material. So for folks here interested in Hekhalot literature from a practitioner point of view, Hekhalot Zutarti is going to be your text. That text is much more interested in adjurations. It's positively obsessed with divine names, and it's very interested in using those divine names for various kinds of things. In fact, Hekhalot Zutarti might contain the remnants of up to 3 different forms of Hekhalot praxes. We'll get into those in a bit, but there may have been 3 different traditions that are still that are encoded in Hekhalot Zutarti. The text Masa Merkavah, this literally means the doing of the Merkavah. It survives in 3 recensions. So it survives in 3 different manuscript traditions. And what we get there is, again, a lot more adjuration material. So a lot of more magical style material, like you might find in the Greek magical papyri. And also this text is also taken with descriptions of the various heavenly palaces or Hekhalot. Merkavah Rabbah, the greater Merkavah text, is interested in memory techniques. One of the things that the Merkavah literature hinges on is the idea that you can forget your Torah, that the mind is somehow weak and you can forget the Torah that you've learned, and that in order to avoid forgetting the Torah, you need access to some kind of magical techniques, or you need other kind of magical help in order to maintain your memory. And there are magical techniques for maintaining the memory here in Merkavah Rabbah. So this may be interesting to people who are fans of Gerardo Bruno and other kinds of memory palace techniques for engaging in this material. What's also interesting is that the Merkavah Rabbah material will often contain the Shiur Koma material. And the Shiur Koma material, as you probably know, is without any doubt in my mind, the strangest Jewish literature ever produced. It contains long lists of the body of God, the various dimensions of the body of God, along with magical names for the various body parts of God. So God's eyebrows have their own unique magical name, and the distance between God's eyebrow is going to be told to you, and it's going to be measured in parsaot and parasangs, which is a Persian unit of measurement. I think it's about 4 miles. So God is enormously, enormously huge. And the Shiur Koma means something like the measure of the vastness, or measurement of the scale. It's a strange name. But anyway, the Shiur Koma literature. Secondly, right, we have next we have the Sefer text called Sefer Hekhalot. Sefer Hekhalot is still in print. You can go buy it. One of the folks in this course went into a Haredi bookstore and got a copy. It's still in print. You can still get it in the Orthodox Jewish world. So Sefer Hekhalot is also known as Third Enoch, and according to Schaeffer, it's the last of the literature to be produced. I have another idea, and I'll just say it. And again, I always tell people that I'm happy to offer up my ideas, but you should also always, if you're going to put your bet down on the real scholars like Schaeffer. But I have the mind that Sefer Hekhalot is such an interesting combination of apocalyptic literature with Hekhalot literature that it might be early, because it's still apocalypticizing. It still has that apocalyptic flair, whereas it may have been an apocalyptic text earlier on, and then Hekhalot material was added into it. And so I tend to see, and this is especially true of the short recension. There's a long and there's a short recension, but at any rate, I tend to think that the apocalyptic material may be earlier. But again, you should always trust what Schaeffer says. Schaeffer is a real scholar, but I'm just some guy. But that's my opinion, just the same. And then we get another final tractate called Masechet Hekhalot, which is mostly an apocalyptic description of the celestial realm. And Davila even says that Masechet Hekhalot Masechet, this means like a treatise or a tractate. But Davila is of the mind that this text is a borderline text. It may be more apocalyptic than Hekhalot, and therefore he thinks of it as a borderline text. So these are our major macroforms. right? This is our major macroforms. Our minor major macroforms, right, is a couple of these, and I'll mention them, but I'm not going to go into a long spiel about them. But we have a text called the Chapters of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. We have a very important text called the Great Seal and Fearsome Crown. This text is very important because Hekhalot Rabbati and Hekhalot Zutarti both say that you need it in order to get into the seventh heaven. So it is a specific adjuration for bypassing the angels of the seventh heaven, and it exists as its own piece of literature. So the Great Seal and Fearful Crown, these are two magical devices that you need in order to get, like I said, into the seventh heaven. This survives as its own independent text. So often what you'll see, I think, in Hekhalot Zutarti, it'll say, you get to the seventh palace, but you need the Great Seal and Fearful Crown, but it doesn't give it to you. You're like, well, where is it? Well, it's over there in another manuscript. So this is an important text. Another text we have is a very brief text called The Ascent of Elisha ben Abuya, Acher. This text is really great because it contains some humor. Elisha ben Abuya goes into the palaces, and God basically makes fun of him. It's a very funny text. Unfortunately, it's supposed to have there's a proverb that was mentioned at the end of it that's sadly missing. And even the scribe in one of the colophons says, I can't find the proverb. But at any rate, it's a fragmentary text, but a funny text where Elisha is sort of the butt of the joke of it. It's in Davila. We have another text called the Sar Panim. The Sar Panim means the prince of the face, literally. It's, again, another text about an angel, specifically the angel that represents the face of God. So Sar Panim is another text called the youth, the Hana'ar. And as you'll know, Hana'ar is almost always a reference to Metatron. The Metatron is often referred to as the youth, and this is probably a reference to Metatron. What's weird, we don't know why Metatron's often referred to as the youth, but because Enoch was 365 years old when he was taken to heaven, and so that's not exactly a youthful dude as far as I can tell. But maybe he's young compared to the rest of the angels who've been there for a bit longer, and therefore he's a new kid on the block, and maybe the angels refer to him as youngin to make fun of him as the newest angel to be added to the group. But he is referred to as the Na'ar, the youth, and Metatron has that title. A couple other fragments that are worth mentioning are the Azhaya fragment. Azhaya is another angel that is important in the Hechal literature, and there's a fragment specifically about him or them. Saying him or her about angels doesn't really make a sense considering they don't have gender. So they're not sexed, so it doesn't make sense to talk about them in that way. There's a text called the Unicum fragment, which is very carefully named. It just means the single fragment. Again, it's just another Hekhalot literature that doesn't have anything specifically distinctive about it. And then there's a bunch of adjacent material, and we're not going to go into the adjacent material, but there's what is called the Visions of Ezekiel. There is the Seder de Rabbi Bereshis. There is there's a text on there's magical literature like the Sefer HaRazim. There's magical literature like the Charba de Moshe, the Sword of Moses. The Havdalah of Rabbi Nechunya, I think, is another magical text that exists. It's also built into Hekhalot Zutarti. It's a lot, folks. This is a very complex material, and we're not even talking about medieval discussions of Merkavah material found in the midrashic literature, which is rabbinical literature, which there is a lot, and also, of course, the Kabbalistic material, in which Hekhalot material is built into Kabbalistic texts like those found in the Sefer Zohar, but also in Abu Lafia, who knows some of this material as well. So this is just a huge mess. But let's get into some of this. Let's get into Hekhalot Rabbati. I just want to walk you through the major ones and sort of talk about them as we go. So Hekhalot Rabbati, as I mentioned, is the longest and it's the most stable text. It's primarily written in Hebrew, but there is a bit of Aramaic and Greek. Again, Hekhalot Rabbati shows evidence of some of the Nomina Barbara being actual Greek texts. And what we have is there's sort of basically two loose texts that have been combined together, focusing primarily on rabbis Ishmael, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. Those are our three heroes. Those are the guys you're going to be reading a lot about. They're always in the literature. Rabbi Ishmael is going to be important because he comes from a priestly family, and he's going to have unique abilities to travel into the Hekhalot because of his priestly background. Rabbi Akiva, of course, is very important because he is successfully able to ascend and descend, and Nechunya ben Hakana is important for reasons that actually aren't or much less clear. He's not a very major character in the rabbinical world, but he becomes a major player in Jewish mysticism. And as you may know, the Sefer Bahir, which is the first text of Kabbalah, the first real text of Kabbalah, is often referred to as the Midrash of Nechunya ben Hakana. So he goes on not only to have great fame as one of the important of the descenders, but he's also associated with the primary text of Kabbalah in the form of the Sefer HaBahir, which again is referred to often as the Midrash of Nechunya ben Hakana. So there are two things in Hekhalot Rabbati that are very important. The first are these narratives, specifically the narrative of the 10 martyrs, which we'll talk about a bit later, but also other narratives of ascent and descent, along with detailed instructions for the various ordeals that you would face along the way, and an enormous amount of hymns. Hekhalot Rabbati is just replete. In many ways, I would say it's a hymnal with Hekhalot material in it. It's more of it has all these really beautiful hymns. And to Schaeffer's point, that part of what we have in the Hekhalot Rabbati is a mysticism of hymns. We have a hymnic mysticism, a liturgical mysticism, and this what he could refer to as unio liturgica. Rather than trying to become one with God in sort of a classic Neoplatonic way, you are trying to become one with the divine liturgy. And that is to say that the earthly liturgy done by Israel is mirrored by the heavenly liturgy, and the idea basically is to make one compact liturgy where angels and humans are sort of engaged phase of the divine, and through engaging in the Hekhalot praxes, you can join with the angels and engage in liturgy for the divine, very proximate to the divine, nearer to God's throne. So this is what Schaeffer refers to as unio liturgica, which I think is an apt way of thinking about what's going on here in Hekhalot Rabbati. We do know this text must have existed by at least the 11th century because it is mentioned by the Chai Gaon. He's a very important leader of the Jewish, he's the most important leader of the Jewish community at that time. And he, in the responsa, which is he's basically being written questions, and someone writes him and says, "Hey, what is this stuff?" And he responds back and says, "I know of these texts. I know how they did it." Some people have read his, and we'll talk about his responsa. Some people read it as a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, not only do I know about it, but I kind of do it. And the Chai Gaon mentions Hekhalot Rabbati and Hekhalot Zutarti. And so we know that by the 11th century, in the Babylonian context, it was known to the Chai Gaon. It contains Sar Torah material. This is the material by which you summon an angel. That occurs in 15 of the manuscripts. So of the 22 manuscripts, 15 contain Sar Torah material. So that's a pretty substantial footprint when it comes to the Sar Torah literature. Now, what's weird about this combination of Hekhalot Rabbati and Sar Torah material is that in the Hekhalot material, obviously, you're descending to the divine throne. Where the Sar Torah material, you're summoning an angel to you. And so it's a kind of an interesting kind of tension. Why do you need to summon the angel to you if you could go visit them yourself, right? And so there's a kind of tension here in the Hekhalot material versus the Sar Torah material, and they seem to be two different praxis traditions that have been welded together for reasons that we don't fully understand, right? Why they've been welded together is not clear, but they have been welded together, and I'll talk more about the Sar Torah material here in just a moment. Schaeffer argues that the hymnic material is the earliest strata of the literature. He puts the date for that but sometime between the 3rd and the 6th century, so that's pretty old for the hymnic material. Then he thinks that there's been an accretion of narrative material, and then a final accretion of what we might think of as magical material. My hackles always go up when people tell me that magic is always added late, and it's almost always added late, and because it's degenerate. You always hear this argument. You hear it about Pistis Sophia. You hear it about other texts. It's like, oh, it's late because there's magic in there. I just don't buy that. I just don't buy that magic means late. I think that, and also I think that the way that we use magic is political. It's an othering term, right? It's what they do. And I think that the way that we've thought about magic and just is often just very wrong-headed historically. And so I don't buy personally that the adjurational material, the magical material, is late. But again, I just want to present you to the standard case and let you make your decisions based on what you think. What makes the most sense to me, and what I think Davila agrees, is that the hymnic material probably has its origins in Palestine. The narrative material seems to have its origins in Babylon. Again, this is the standard take on this. And then what we have is the text goes on the road. It travels to Egypt, where we obviously find remnants of it in the Geniza. It seems to go over North Africa and eventually makes its way into Italy, because we see it in Italy. We see it in Italian manuscripts. It also appears in some Byzantine manuscripts, but eventually, of course, it makes its way to Germany, where it's finally redacted into the form that we now know it by the Chasdei Ashkenaz. So again, an enormously traveled piece of literature, right? This text is traveling, goes from the Sasanian, from Palestine to the Sasanian Empire, back to Egypt, Muslim Egypt, and then north into Christian Italy, right? Which at this time would be quite early, maybe, and then north even further up into Germany. So this is literature that really is on the move. The theological stuff that matters for Hekhalot Rabbati is the sovereignty and holiness of God. God is weirdly, mysteriously missing in Hekhalot Rabbati. They talk around God a lot, but God is very kind of removed in Hekhalot Rabbati. But the two things that they do focus on a lot are the divine throne. There's a lot of material in there about the divine throne. Obviously, it is Merkavah material after all. And of course, they're very interested in God's robe. And they're interested in God's robe because it seems like in Hekhalot Rabbati, the very cosmos itself, stars and other celestial structures, flow from God's robe. And so it's in some sense the world, the physical world that we live in, is like a robe that God wears. And so the stars and moon and all the various entities that live are part of the divine garment. And this focus on the divine garment is going to be a big deal in Hekhalot Rabbati. And as you probably know, there's a very important, there's a Gnostic element here as well, where the divine robe is also a big deal in some other Gnostic texts. And of course, you may know that there's an important piece of Jewish magical literature called the Sefer HaMalbush. And the Sefer HaMalbush is meant to be a kind of magical robe that also appears in some of this really early material as well. So again, I think this magic, again, saying magic is always late is, I'm not so sure. We get the classic biblical angels. So we're going to see a lot of Michael and Gabriel. So they're going to be hanging out, obviously, up in the Hekhalot. But we're going to meet some new angels. Surya is an important angel in the Hekhalot material. This is often the escort angel. This is the angel that's going to escort you into the divine palaces. This is sometimes the angel of God's presence. And of course, also we get Samael, which is the closest thing to a satanic figure in the Hekhalot literature. And this is a very typical name for this evil entity in rabbinical mindset. Samael is almost always the closest thing you're going to get to a devil character in rabbinical literature, but also this is true in Hekhalot literature and in the Zohar. We also get angels like Anathiel, where another deity, another angel who's going to be important in escorting human beings. But of course, Metatron and the Shekhinah make appearances as well. Again, lots of focus on divine worship. Again, part of the thrust of Hekhalot Rabbati is that you want to join in with the divine liturgy. And so there's going to be a huge amount of material there. But I will say that along with the hymnic material, there is adjurational material. I prefer the term adjurational material, the magical material, because magic just has such a loaded connotation to it. But the adjuration, there is an important adjuration of Surya, and this is the most important adjuration because this is what basically kicks you up into the Hekhalot. But it involves 112, exactly 112 invocations of various guardian angels along with their seals, and these have to be counted on your fingers to not miss one, because if you miss one, it can lead, you can guess it, to disastrous results where you get massacred. So there's all kinds of intentional stuff with the 112 invocations, and also there's a special praxis here for reaching into the seventh Hechal, which of course is the divine throne room, and that seventh Hechal is going to be where you're going to need the other text, the great fear, the great seal, and the fearful crown. So that's Hekhalot Rabbati. As I mentioned, the Sar Torah literature is also attached to Hekhalot Rabbati. What's interesting about the Sar Torah literature is that it is for rapidly acquiring rabbinical wisdom. Now, this is one of the weird things we're going to talk about next week, or at least begin talking about next week, is that one of the going theories about who wrote all this material is that they were anti-rabbis, that they were anti-rabbinical. Well, this is a strange thing, that if they are at some level anti-rabbinical, why would they include in so many of their manuscripts special invocations to get rabbinical wisdom? Now, they're getting rabbinical wisdom by acquiring it rapidly through angelic dispensation. But if they're anti-rabbi, why would they care at all? And so it sort of just invites the question is, yes, they might be weirdos in the sense that they're not studying the way that they're supposed to be studying, but who here wouldn't want just to be able to download all the wisdom all at once if you could summon an angel and do it? So I think that what we're looking at here is what I call para-rabbinical, that they are rabbis, but they're looking for hacks, right? They're looking for like cheat codes, right? And then the Sar Torah basically is a cheat code for rabbinical wisdom by which you get a rapid download of all this material into your head. What's also important here is that the angels in the Sar Torah literature do not like the idea that we're going to get all this material. They don't like us. Again, this sort of angelic antagonism is typical of rabbinical literature, but the idea of the literature, as we'll get into it, is that Israel basically complains that they don't have enough time to study because they're now rebuilding the temple after the destruction of the Babylonian exile, and they don't have any time to study anymore, and therefore they say, hey, we just need to learn all this stuff really quickly, and therefore God grants them a dispensation with the Sar Torah praxis, so they can rapidly learn all this while they're doing all the hard work of rebuilding the temple. So we have some Agada material, we have some legendary material, and then we have the praxis material. Now, what's really important about the praxis material of the Sar Torah is that much of the praxis of the Sar Torah is going to be built into other Hekhalot texts. So various cycles of fasting, celibacy, various kinds of ritual immersions, the same kind of stuff that we're going to see in the Sar Torah literature is that kind of praxis is going to be built into other Hekhalot texts as well. Now, we know this one's even earlier because we have an example of this being mentioned by a 10th century Karaite. Now, folks may know who the Karaites are and were. The Karaites were Jews who rejected the authority of the rabbis, and they rejected the authority of oral Torah, and then they made their own oral Torah, which none of them would admit to, but that's what happens anyway. But one of the things that they slam the rabbis about, and this is telling, again, I think this matters, is the Karaites say that the Rabbinites are over there practicing magic, that they're involved in all kinds of shenanigans, and they're not good Jews because they practice magic. And one of the examples of the magic that the Karaites claim that the Rabbinites are practicing is Sar Torah stuff, which again tells me that this is not an anti-rabbinical group of people, that the Karaites are probably actually being correct here, that in fact, the Rabbinites are engaging in magical praxis, and some of that magical praxis takes the form of the Sar Torah literature. So we do have Salman ben Yeruchim saying, hey, look, the Rabbinites are wrong, and one of the examples of the proof the Rabbinites are wrong is because they're over there doing magic, and it's kishuf, and the Torah forbids it, and they're over there jumping and doing shenanigans to be able to do all this kishuf, all this sorcery, and it's not allowed. I would say that for my folks interested in the Greek magical papyri, the Sar Torah literature looks a lot like material from the Greek magical papyri, but also should be compared to texts like the Sefer HaRazim, the Book of Secrets, also recovered, by the way, from the Cairo Geniza, and also texts like the Charbad Moshe, an Aramaic text of magic, which also has its origins in this time period as well. The big theological moves in the Sar Torah literature are, one, angelic hostility, right? Angelic hostility is a very typical motif of both rabbinical lore, but also of the Hekhalot literature. We see it here in the Sar Torah, because again, the angels did not want to give us access to this magical technology, and God takes special dispensation to give it to us. So it's a very compassionate God who gives us basically, a game genie to hack knowledge. I'm showing my age here, referencing 1990s video game hacks. But basically, it's a hack, right? It's a hack to get this stuff, and God does it out of God's compassion. But what we have here, right, is a 12-day praxis of isolation, of purification, followed by a series of prayers and adjurations before the actual summoning of the Sar Torah, the Prince of the Torah, I should say. This is how it's translated. And then, you also use the Great Seal and Fearful Crown in this adjuration as well. I am of the mind that what we may be looking at in the Sar Torah literature is that we may be looking at an ancestor of what became the Abramelin ritual and maybe even the Ars Notoria. So I believe, and again, I don't have a ton of evidence for this, but I have some reason to believe that the Sar Torah is about summoning this angel to get this magical knowledge. I think that the Abramelin and some of the Ars Notoria literature may be downstream of the Sar Torah literature. So again, this is a place where Western esotericism is probably, or rather the Hekhalot literature is interacting at the very basis of Western esotericism, and it may be the case that we may be looking at the ancestor of some of these incredibly important magical technologies that were developed in the European context. Hekhalot Zutarti, and we'll finish Hekhalot Zutarti today, and then we'll wrap and get back to the rest of the material next week. Hekhalot Zutarti was written in Hebrew and Aramaic. It may be the oldest of the Hekhalot literature. Again, Schaeffer thinks that it is not. I think Davila thinks that it is. I think it's maybe Halpern that thinks it's the oldest. It is, for folks, like I said, for folks who are really interested in the praxis side of this, Hekhalot Zutarti is the most praxis-oriented text. It is filled with adjurations. It is filled with theurgical material, all centering on Rabbi Akiva. And this is a text where almost every page is going to give you some tool, some technique, some text that you're going to use to go through the various thrones of God. Perhaps the most important literary element in Hekhalot Zutarti is what is called the throne midrash, which is a breakdown of the divine throne in terms of all the different names of the various aspects of the divine throne. Now, I don't know exactly what's going on in that text, but I've looked at a lot of other material, and it looks to me like this is something like is meant to be read out loud, perhaps akin to a mantra, where you get very highly repetitive text with very important divine names, which are incredibly repetitious. And again, as we know, things like repetition, divine names can have great effects on our consciousness. And I think that what we're looking at are the remains, or not the remains of, but we're looking at some elements of what Davila calls Jewish shamanism, where these mantras are basically meant to induce you into an alteration of consciousness, and they deliver you into the world of the Hekhalot, because you are basically going inside yourself, altering your consciousness, and it's through the recitation of these mantras, which I don't like borrowing Eastern language. I'm not super familiar with it. And so with all due respect and caveats, but something like magical language meant to alter consciousness. So something like that. The throne midrash very much to me looks like that kind of material. The praxis is not coherent in Hekhalot Zutarti. What it looks like to me is that there are several praxes here that have been fossilized into one document. So we may be looking at different techniques, which again, it should be unsurprising, right? Because what gets me into the alteration that I need is not going to be what's going to get you into that same headspace. So I think that it's unsurprising we find different techniques for how to do this that have been, like I said, fossilized into one document. And it's often to see where they are can be quite complicated, but when we get into them, and specifically the lectures on praxis, we'll be paying a lot of attention to them and trying to reconstruct what some of these praxes may have looked like. And as I mentioned, this text is mentioned also by the Hagon in the 11th century. Specifically, Synopsis 424 is our absolute best glimpse into the Hekhalot practice. So this is our best glimpse into what they were doing. And that, of course, involves special breathing techniques, special bodily postures, singing incantations facing the ground. We don't know what those incantations were exactly, but I would suspect that they are, in fact, buried here in Hekhalot Zutarti and other texts. But they survive in lots of manuscripts, including really early text from the Cairo Geniza. Yeah, let's wrap up Hekhalot Zutarti for today, and then we'll get the next ones next week. Hekhalot Zutarti is a redactional nightmare. It is multiform to the point of there's no way to establish what the Verlaga was. We don't know what the original text was. We know that it's coherent enough that we can recognize it as Hekhalot Zutarti, but it is so multiform in its different editions that it's hard to nail down exactly what the original text would have looked like. What Davila does, to his credit, and I really appreciate what he does, is Davila produces a maximum example of the text. So he takes every text of Hekhalot Zutarti that exists, and he puts every single piece of it out there. So the Murray Jones version of Hekhalot Zutarti, for instance, left out some magical elements, whereas some manuscripts do have those magical elements. Davila includes everything. So he produces a maximally diplomatic edition in his translation, which I really appreciate. But again, the text is incredibly diverse. And if you look at it in the Davila translation, sometimes 4/5 of the page are just manuscript variations. And it's just maddening. But I'd rather you see that and know that it's that diverse than him hide that diversity from you, so that you could pretend that it is more simple than it is, but it is in fact quite complicated. At any rate, it does contain those first-person plural Akiva narratives, which again Murray Jones takes to be pre-Talmudic, that going back to perhaps to Akiva himself, which I'm inclined to believe him about that. And Hekhalot Zutarti highlights practice over narrative. So whereas Hekhalot Rabbati contains a lot of narrative text, what we might call agada, Hekhalot Zutarti is about praxes. So it is most of the text is about praxis. Now, before you get too excited about that, what also Hekhalot Zutarti focuses on is on the fact that the world of the Merkavah is nightmarish. If you've had the chance to read Hekhalot Zutarti, you will know full well that the mythscape there is nightmarish, with rivers of fire and giant horses that drink blood and all kinds of stuff. It's really a hellscape. And so there, on the one hand, the text is inviting you into praxis, and on the other hand, it's saying, this is really a scary place, right? I mean, if you ever get the chance, I would highly encourage you to read it. It looks more like Dante's hell than it does heaven. And it's again, is the writer trying to scare us away? I don't know. But it's very clear that whatever they imagine the world of the Hekhalot to be, it's a pretty horrifying, even Lovecraftian world up there, down there, wherever it is. And so now the good news about that is it's just replete with metal band names. So you can just, if you're starting a metal band, just go to Hekhalot Zutarti and just open the book somewhere, and you'll get the angels that drink blood out of the size of mangers of Caesarea. What is crazy stuff. But at any rate, it's fantastically metal in that respect as well. The text is also obsessive with divine names to a point where it gets difficult to even follow what's happening. The text has a kind of maddening quality in that it's just like divine name after divine. It's like, here are 47 divine names for bypassing this, and here are 14 divine names for this. And sometimes the text is just literally a wall of divine names. And it's not clear even what to do with them sometimes. It's like, here's some divine names. Like, for what? And so the text is obsessed with them in a way that is difficult to get at. But the places where the text does mention what they're for, it's almost always protection magic. And again, that should be obvious. Why? because Hekhalot Zutarti imagines the world of the Hekhalot to be dangerous. And you have to have lots and lots of layers of protection in order to defend yourself from these horrifying horses and various other kinds of angels that are trying to kill you, and not just kill you in a normal way, but kill you in like triple, quadruple dare kill you, like rip you apart, pour your stomach out, and melt your face. I mean, it's just like, extreme violence. So I think there's a text where it says they throw you on to like 30,000 axes or something. So it's just, it's just it's like Mortal Kombat overkill. So at any rate, you get just all kinds of stuff, but the text does give us a great deal of praxes, including things like fasting, isolation, various purification, sexual continence. Again, this is all meant to be angelifying, right? You're going into the world of the angels, and you need to be like an angel. And what are the things that we know that angels don't do? They don't eat. We know that they're pure. They purify themselves in the rivers of fire that exist in the world of the Hekhalot. They don't have sex, so you can't have sex. And by the way, if you do these 40-day fasts and you have a nocturnal emission, as the text has it, you got to start all over, right? Because semen it renders you tuma, and therefore you're not like an angel anymore, and you can't do this. Then you get these incantations that are whispered at the earth in certain kinds of body postures. This body posture is sometimes referred to as the Jeremiah position, where your feet are up, or your knees are up, and your head's between your legs, and you're basically weeping. And so this is sometimes referred to as the Jeremiah pose. He was known famously as the weeping prophet. So now exactly what those body positions are meant to do, I've tried them, and I can say that you could, I imagine, using certain breathing techniques, perhaps get yourself into like a hyperventilated state or some other kind of state where an alteration of consciousness could take place. I don't recommend anyone try to put their head between their legs and hyperventilate themselves to go to the world of the Merkavah, but that is the closest thing we do get to something like a praxis in terms of what they were doing to induce these states. I will say that what's interesting is that we get this praxis about how to do it with this weird body posture, but almost always when the text describe people in the world of the Hekhalot, they're almost always described as just sitting there. So it's not clear exactly if you work yourself into this state and then you're just sitting normally, or you would stay in that so-called Jeremiah position. I don't know. Again, it's very mysterious, because again, the text don't need to tell you it, because you would be learning this from a teacher anyway. The teacher is going to pass on this stuff orally to you and show you how to do it, not write it down. Again, like you can go read a book about how bicycles work, but you don't learn to ride bicycles from books. You learn to ride a bicycle from a person showing you how to do it. No amount of physics is ever going to teach you to ride a bicycle. Ditto with magical praxis. You have to get someone to show you how to ride the bicycle, and reading about a bicycle is not at all riding one. Just one more text before we wrap for the day, because we'll get started a little later than normal. The Maaseh Merkavah is another group of prayers and adjurations, primarily in Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic. It contains some Sar Torah literature that's basically been retooled for, rather than bringing the angel here, they retool the praxis to take you to the angels. So again, we see the Sar Torah literature being manipulated in order to basically retooling it, hacking it, to allow you to make the journey to the world of the Hekhalot. Again, we see the same guys, Akiva, Ishmael, Nechuni ben Hakana. It survives in about 10 different manuscripts, and then about several different recensions, and it was also known to Eliezer of Worms, who, as I mentioned earlier, writes one of the more famous commentaries to Sefer Yetzirah, and it's in Eliezer of Worms's commentary to Sefer Yetzirah that we see the first golems being made, aside from the reference we see in Tractate Sanhedrin. But at any rate, clearly magical. Eliezer of Worms is very interested in magic, and it shows up there as well. Again, the prayer literature, the hymnic literature, is being dated to the 4th to 7th century Palestinian context. So again, pretty early material in a Palestinian context. with, again, the argument being made that narrative and magical text have accreted onto the text over time. Again, we can take that the idea that this accretion theory is, we can take it for whether we want to or not. But again, this text is also very interested in divine names, and it lists lots of different groups of divine names, including the famous 42-letter divine name. That's folks may know that there's a 42-letter divine name. There's a 72-letter divine name, both of which are pulled out of the Torah. This text knows both of them and is interested in both of them. This text is also interested in the geography of the world of the Merkavah. This is our best text for mapping out what the Merkavah looks like, and it's scary. I mean, it's rivers of fire and storehouses of hail and dangerous rainbows that'll kill you and all kinds of stuff. So it's really describing what the world of the Merkavah looks like. And of course, we'll be dealing with a whole course here in just a couple of weeks with the mythscape of what I'm calling it of the Merkavah. So we're going to work through all the texts to describe what the world looks like. And again, of course, we get the same stock group of angels like Michael, Gabriel, but we also get an important angel that occurs in a lot of the Hekhalot material, an angel known as Katzpiel. And of course, we also get the angel of Gehinnom. So the angel of the bad underworld. He also makes an appearance in Maaseh Merkavah as well. And again, like I said, this text employs a series of prayers and a retooled version of the Sar Torah literature for making the heavenly ascent. So it seems like the Sar Torah literature, just so I can make this clear, it looks like the Sar Torah technique is at the foundation of a lot of the praxes that goes on in the text. Really importantly, that a really important prayer that is found first, earliest in Maaseh Merkavah is Alela Shebeach, which for folks who are folks who've been were at shul, you'll know that is the introductory prayer for the Aleinu. The Aleinu prayer, of course, goes back to temple days, but the introductory prayer for the Aleinu, Alela Shebeach, that prayer finds it first in this Merkavah text. So that's two pieces of liturgy that have made their way from the Merkavah literature into Jewish liturgy. The other being El Adon, and this here being Alela Shebeach, which is found in it's found at Synopsis 550. But again, the same typical Sar Torah praxis with fasting, immersion, central deprivation. Also, it's interesting in the Maaseh Merkavah, there's prohibitions on what you can look at. You're not supposed to look at anybody, basically. You're not supposed to look at anyone's face, but you're supposed to especially avoid looking at women, because even looking at a woman who is menstruating will disqualify you from the praxis. So, and again, sight in the rabbinical imagination is much more haptic. We think of sight as basically sort of passive, like you're looking at something doesn't affect you, but the idea is that if you look at certain kinds of people, it can have effects on you, and there's an idea that you need to not look at anyone. In fact, the text says basically to look at the ground if you have to go around people, to avoid looking at people to avoid people looking at the faces of people. This also includes the magical circle. Maaseh Merkavah is the only text that involves the use of a magical protective circle. That's not found in any other text. So again, we have magical circles. And again, if we're thinking about this text as being 3rd, 4th century, or 4th, 7th century Palestine, that's one of the earliest examples of a magical circle being mentioned in the literature, the esoteric literature of the West. Magical circles, of course, play a huge role in Western magic, especially Solomonic magic. This is one of the earliest places where we see an example of a magical circle being used as part of the Maaseh Merkavah praxis, along with sealing your body with various incantations to protect your body from these things. So, at any rate, finally, right, it includes an adjuration for invoking the Shekhinah, the presence of God, and finally, a very mysterious and very interesting adjuration for invoking an entity that it calls the one above the seraphim. Now, as you probably know, the seraphim is are the angels that most directly orbit the throne of God. They're the ones who say, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And they're often thought to rotate around the throne of God. And they're often thought of as, I mean, they're on fire. The seraphim literally means the burning ones. And we have an adjuration in the text, in this text, Massa Merkavah, for invoking some entity known as the one above the seraphim. Now, it's not clear who that is, because theoretically that should be God, but it might be Metatron, right? It might be Metatron, but we don't know what entity in the sort of the ecology of that world, right? What is above the seraphim? Maybe it's the throne of God, maybe it's Metatron. And again, Metatron's allowed to sit on the throne of God. So maybe it's Metatron, but we don't know. At any rate, the adjuration is there. You can read it. It is mysterious, but it is the kind of thing that again, if you know your mythscape of the world of the Merkavah, you're just sort of puzzled by what that might be, the one that is above the seraphim. And anyway, come back next week, folks. What we're going to do is we're going to wrap up going through the last major macroforms, right? We got a few more macroforms to go through. And then what we're going to do is we're going to begin to turn our attention to the people who did this, right? Who are these people? And we're really going to dig into the question of who are the descenders? What is their social profile? What is their relationship with the rabbis? Because they don't tell us anything about themselves. We never get in these texts a descender telling us about themselves. So they remain a bit opaque, but I think I would like to get a sense of who they are. And so what we're going to do next week is that we will continue looking at the major microforms. Then we're going to take a look at, beginning next week, we'll take a look at who are these people? What do we know about them? What can we read between the lines of these texts to get a sense of who these descenders are? Because they're hiding behind Rabbi Akiva. They're hiding behind Nehunya ben Hakana. They're using those names as placeholders for whoever they were. And so the question is, who's back behind this literature? What's their social position? What do they know, right? Who are they? And so we're going to get into the mystery of the people behind this material, and we will turn to them, the personalities behind this material, after we finish the major finish the major and minor macroforms next week, as we turn to the mystery of who's behind the Maaseh, the Merkavah, the doing of the Merkavah.